Hey y'all, welcome to Uncle Dan's Front Porch. Man, I'm sitting out here enjoying this crisp 28-degree weather in sunny northwest Florida. Why don't you just come right on up, sit down, sip some coffee, and listen to me chat to you a little bit about somebody that I find very interesting. This fictional character called Ebenezer Scrooge. Today I want to talk to you about living rich. Now, Ebenezer Scrooge, if you've watched the movies or read the book, you'll find out that he was a man who did not understand how to live rich in the beginning, and a series of dreams helped him understand that. The name Ebenezer is quite interesting. It's translated from a Hebrew word, which means, to this point, God has helped us. And his last name Scrooge, because of that story, when we say someone's being a Scrooge, we generally mean that they are withholding something that they could give to help somebody. So, encapsulated in his name is the two different mindsets of living. One, the mindset of having an open hand, where not only are you giving freely, but your hand's open to receive some things. And living with a closed hand is just kind of that symbol of just grabbing on tighter and tighter. And as a result, your soul gets darker. Well, I believe that as a child of God, I'm rich. I have access to all God's resources, in a sense. Now, obviously, he qualifies and restricts access for my good, even though I may believe he's withholding something that I deserve. And in fact, if I buy into this belief that I'm not rich, I'm kind of agreeing with the devil that God is withholding something that I deserve. So, let's talk about this living rich. I think one of the things we need to take a look at is what Scripture, God's communication to us, what he says about being rich or wanting to be rich. And in Proverbs, a book written by the wisest man that ever lived, he says that you give freely, you get more. And if you withhold what's right, then you end up becoming poor. He also says that generous people become enriched, and anyone trusting in riches will fall. And you'll find all of that in Proverbs 11, verses 24 to 28. He also wrote this book called Ecclesiastes, and in chapter 5, verse 10, he says, the one who loves money will never be satisfied with money. I believe that when you love money, it ends up replacing your trust and dependence on God. That's a serious issue. Now, in the New Testament, we find in the book of Hebrews, chapter 13, it instructs us to live our lives free of the love of money. And it says we should be satisfied, because he has told us way back in the Old Testament, I will never leave you or forsake you. And because he said that, we can also say, the Lord is my helper, I will not be afraid. So we've got some pretty good indication, really quick, what God has to say about loving money and wanting to be rich. Now, the Apostle Paul, one of the most prolific writers in the New Testament, he writes his instruction to his young protege, Timothy. He says, godliness with contentment is great gain, or the way to get rich. Now, he goes on to write to his protege. He says, look, you need to be content with having food and clothes. That's really all you need. Because he says you came into the world with nothing and you're leaving with nothing. So as long as you got something to wear, something to eat, be happy. And then he says, wanting to be rich makes you fall into traps and do stuff otherwise you'll never do. The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil and stupid behavior. And he says, instead of chasing after money, chase after righteousness or right living, godliness, love, faith, gentleness, and endurance. This same Apostle Paul also wrote to a church in Philippi, and he told them, this is in chapter 4 if you care to look it up, starting in verse 12. He says, I know how to live with a lot, I know how to live with a little. I can be content in no matter what circumstance I am. He says, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. And then a little bit later on, he tells this church, he says, my God will supply all your needs according to all his riches in glory. The most powerful being in the universe, who has everything, can definitely take care of your needs. Now, in the economy of God's kingdom, this is my opinion based on everything that I've read, the economy of God's kingdom really is driven on this belief that God will supply our needs. And what that does is that frees us up to be generous to everybody. And as a result, we create this momentum that causes us as a community of believers to be rich. And this richness ends up spilling over on the unbelievers. You can't hide who you are. You can't hide this excitement. And when you're generous, it's going to end up spilling on people who's even outside your family. But as a result of this spilling onto unbelievers, it ends up sucking some of them into this vortex, this community of God's people, this awesomeness that we have. Now, I don't know if you're very familiar with Scripture, but I just want to point out a couple things also in the New Testament, more stuff that this Apostle Paul wrote. He wrote in 2 different places that God gives his believers gifts or special abilities and functions for the benefit of the rest of the community of believers. And in Ephesians chapter 4 specifically, he says that this is to train those who are coming behind us for the work of the kingdom. Is to build, encourage, or strengthen the community of believers until we all reach this unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God. We are richer as a community, folks. And the way to become rich is to realize that God has given us, is to realize all that God has given us and to realize all the ways that he has helped us up to this point. And believing that he's always got my back, then I use my time, my talents, that's my abilities, and the treasures, my money, to benefit other people. Y'all, that is living rich. It's easier for God to fill an open hand than a closed one. In fact, you close your hand, you not only close your hand to God's riches, but you also close yourself off from benefiting others. Listen, I'm here to tell you, if you're God's child, you're rich, start living like it. This is Uncle Dan on his front porch, wishing you a prosperous, a generous, a God-filled, awesome year. People, it's time to start creating this momentum that blows our communities' minds to the point that they start looking into what the world we got going on. If you're God's child, God bless you. Live rich. This is Uncle Dan on his front porch, wishing you an awesome Sunday.